Today we will discuss the phenomena of the E-Girl through the lens of the sociologist Jean Baudrillard. We will in specific see how the theory of simulation and simulacra will account for this modern phenomenon. However, the conclusion of this video will derive something somewhat distinct from the theory in its original conception. We wish to make this clear beforehand so we are not met with the accusation of misspreading Baudrillard. The fundamental notions of which we will base our thesis on are found in Baudrillard's book, Simulacra and Simulation. Here we shall define what each of these terms are and provide examples to supplement further understanding. A simulation is a symbolic representation or copy of something that attempts to portray the real object in an authentic sense. However, this notion of simulation is proper to the first order in the quote-unquote phases of symbols, and this is known as reflection, a simulation in its authentic sense, so to speak. An example here would be a realistic portrait of a person where the details are nearly identical in expression of the simulation. The next phase of simulation is mask, which is a representation of the real object but an improper and slightly out of touch one. For example, a poorly done portrait where the details are off or missing, but despite this you can still tell who it is supposed to represent. The third phase is where we see the first notion of simulacra occur, that is to say, illusion, which is a false representation of an object or an object referencing another object arbitrarily. An example would be a portrait meant to represent a man, but the portrait is a painting of another man and not the man it is meant to represent, therefore creating a dialectical tension between reality and its representation in a very clear sense here. The fourth and final phase is that of pure simulacra, where this representation cannot be called a representation since it does not represent anything, rather it has its own existence in and of itself. It cannot be correlated with reality at all, actually. An example would be a Jackson Pollock painting being said to be a human being when in reality nothing proper to humanity can be attributed to it. And this painting now stands on its own and has become non-relational to reality in the sense of symbolic correlation between symbolic realities and symbolic image and external foundation in the organic world, or the external world. The hyperreal is a simulation that becomes more real than actual reality. This is not understood in a literal sense, as that would be a contradiction. But what this is meant to convey is that a simulation has shifted our understanding of reality in a way that the simulation of reality becomes to us more epistemologically valid than actual reality itself. Simply put, the simulation is what is real, and this we unconsciously push aside the reality of the state of affairs. We think the simulation is real when in reality it's actually not. It's, the example here would be the Vietnam War. The war was very quickly made into a form of media entertainment in cinema, and this for most people is what comes to mind when thinking about the Vietnam War, despite the fact the war is not actually the same as its representation in motion picture. The only real way to understand the war would be either to experience it yourself or have direct access to historical data of the war, but even this access to data is in a sense a reduction of the war down to a matter of statistics rather than concrete reality. In our contemporary culture, the advent of the internet has very quickly led to this thing which we call online communities, in which the niche interest of an individual can be expressed. In its early form, these were seen in chat rooms and forums, and these were in themselves considered a form of simulation. They can be considered that, in that it simulates community without actually being a community. Of course, humans being what they are, they eventually use the medium of the internet to express sexual desire as seen in the mass distribution of pornographic media. Many of these online communities orbit around things like video games and anime. In these forms of media, hypersexual, animated, and unrealistic forms of women are represented, and this often is, of course, over time transposed onto its respective fan base, who end up lusting over these simulated forms of femininity, which do not correspond very much to reality at all. In this sense, these female forms will correspond to the phase we denoted hitherto as mask, as they somewhat represent the true female form. However, they insert idiosyncrasies into the true form of the feminine, taking away its ability to correspond to the first and authentic phase, which is called reflection. Due to this, fantasy woman is sort of now in between the simulation and simulacra, and thus a sort of synthesis. We see this in the category, once again, of quote unquote mask in the phases of symbols. This then inculcates into the male consumer a feeling of lust, even to the point where he prefers these fake women to real women, creating an isolated male, so to speak. This here is the hyperreal for what we call the quote unquote bug man. That is the man who lives to consume all forms of hedonistic pleasure, akin to Nietzsche's last man, who does not have any notion of overcoming the self. These fake women become the object of desire, and then we see these men develop obsessions over these fake women and characters in media. The passage from the hyperreal to the real. However, an interesting scenario occurs where we see the hyperreal, that is the animated fantasy girl in this case, pass back into reality, manifesting itself in real human form in the quote unquote E-Girl. This is almost analogous to the sort of golem that can be manifested into reality through a kind of imitation of humanity. Here we see humanity mimic technology rather than the other way around, as these women model themselves after fantasy women with their makeup and outfits. However, this is an inevitability since the inception of technology, as technology in its ability to open opportunities changes our outlook on the world, phenomenologically speaking. Furthermore, we see these quote unquote e-girls attracting all the men who were previously attracted to simulated women, as now their object of desire has transcended the hyperreal back into the real in a circular fashion, as it was the female form absorbed into the simulation at first and then fed back into reality. It was only able to be fed back into reality because of the influence on the men who, in their exclusive attraction to these women, became fixated on the now hyperreal, a sort of sexual hyperreal for these men. As this is seen as the ideal notion of women more than the actual women are. The collective shift in male subjectivity alongside the female shift created this phenomenon of the hyperreal coming back into the real. Because of the male shift in desire to simulated women becoming hyperreal, this lack of recognition in mass, that is, the lack of recognition in women, created a shift in female subjectivity in order to adapt to this lack of subjective recognition by their male counterparts. Thus, some subset of the female population had to take the hyperreal for these men and make it into reality. I assert that this shift in male attitude, whilst not being the average form of male sexual desire, must have significantly increased for women to adapt to it in order to garner the attention of these males, because if the male population doing this were such a small minority, they could easily be brushed aside for lack of a better term, superior men